Okay, now in the second part, we're going to look not only build on this idea that the search for universal truth is a primary value, I suppose, or one of the primary drivers of Western science. We also look at it from this approach of how do they do this? The scientific method is a process. Mathematics is the language that's used to talk about that process and talk about and describe what that process has identified and developed. But one of the things that happened during the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries is we began to see this idea of a reductionist approach, and this comes from Descartes. And Rene Descartes, he was the guy that came up with the idea of I think, therefore I am, which, by the way, from a philosophical perspective is very important because it privileges the mind again by saying that the only thing that you know for sure that you exist is through your mind. Everything else is subject to doubt. And so again, we have this privileging of the mind. But part of the process of how do you describe the world, you've got this whole giant world to look at, and you're trying to create a method for rationally looking at this. And rationality is very much connected to this whole process. In fact, in terms of the search for truth as being one of the major drivers of Western science, I think rationality is probably the second greatest driver. And rationality can be defined in several different ways, but usually when people are being rational, they take all the emotion out of whatever it is they're being rational about. But it also talks about dividing things up. And when you rationalize something, not in terms of rationalizing your behavior and saying, well, I have an excuse for what I did, but when you rationalize, say, the development, you want to make something and you rationalize the process for making something, it means you divide it into discrete parts, discrete steps that have to be followed. And so as this period of rationality, or they call them the rationalists, who were these philosophers, but as this period of scientific growth of the power of science, as that grew, people became more rational in terms of how they look at a whole lot of things. And I think that you can also look at this period of time as this challenge, fight going on between the church and the science community, to the point where the church was wanting to imprison these people who are using science to describe the world in a way that the church did not agree with. And of course, the church is based largely in emotion and therefore not rational. And so this whole rationality, this whole rational approach to the description of the world began a process that we now call the reductionist approach. And the reductionist approach is where you look at the very smallest component of a particular item. It also includes compartmentalization and classification of things, and we'll get to that here in a couple of minutes. But when I first took biology class, I was really thrown for a loop at the college level. When I was in high school, is another thing, but when I was in college, and I took my first biology class, the first place we started was the cell, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's neat to see the cell and the cell membrane and the nuclei and all that kind of stuff. And then we broke that up a little bit and started talking about the mitochondria and how, certain traits are carried on through genes and things like that. But I thought it was very, very fascinating that we started at the smallest first. And since I never took a second biology course, the only biology course I had kept my focus on the smallest thing, as opposed to a more holistic perspective. But that's the reductionist perspective. That is, you start at the bottom. You start at the smallest component. I wouldn't say you start at the bottom because pyramids are bigger at the bottom than they are at the top. But you look at the smallest component. In physics, you start off looking at the atom and what's the atom made of, in terms of a nucleus and electrons and protons. The same thing with chemistry. You look primarily at those atomic and molecular structures. So you look at those smallest perspective first. The other aspect of this reductionist perspective is that things are compartmentalized by some form of rational description that says these things are connected somehow. Let me give you an example. You can look up, you look at, there's this tree thing that it's called taxonomy. That's the name of the science that's related to how things are described, defined, and how it's decided how they're related. So you'll see, sometimes you open up a biology book or a botany book or something like that, and you'll see this tree. And the tree has, these branches. And one branch, let's say if you're looking at animals, one branch says vertebrae, and then the other says non-vertebrae. And if you're looking at the branch that says vertebrae, that means they have a backbone, and non-vertebrae means they don't have a backbone. And then you're looking at these animals that have backbones on this one branch, and then the smaller branch goes up, and it's let's say it's horses. I forget what the scientific name for horses is, but anyway, they'll have all the animals that are related to the horses for whatever reason that they made for whatever reason they decided that they were related. Horses don't have a split hoof, so obviously that has something to do with it. Horses, only have one stomach. They're not like cows and goats, and they don't have all these different stomachs, and so they're not what they call a ruminid, and they're not an ungulate because they don't have a split hoof. So they've named all of these different kinds of ways that animals and plants and minerals and elements and everything is categorized and compartmentalized, which ultimately means then that the way to see if things are related is to see how these taxonomists have identified what traits these taxonomists have identified that says that these beings or these entities or these substances are somehow related. Excuse me. Now these are done in a very, quote, rational way, meaning that there's certain things that they've thought about, taking away all emotion from that, and to create these categories. And then they've compartmentalized, and through their description of the world, everything is classified a certain way. And with those classifications comes the compartmentalization. That the connection between things is not always seen. Because you start off, like I say, you're looking at the smallest component, you're looking at a compartment, you're looking at particular classification, and Western science does not encourage, the looking at the whole thing. And so this idea of reductionist, rationalist approach is another very, very important part of the basis for Western science. Sometimes I just wonder, just kind of sneaking into the indigenous knowledge, but I just wonder what was the basis for tribal taxonomies. We know that our description of the world, things are related the same way that the West has identified things as being related. But I'm wondering what the basis for how we decide things are related. Like the West says primates are those animals that have opposable thumbs. What's the basis for determining how things are related in a tribal world view? Could it be all the things that are red and fly, or whatever it is? I don't know. But the fact is to some degree, these compartments and classifications are fairly arbitrary, but they are designed for a universal application, not just a local application.